All right, let's get started. Our first presentation is titled Technology in the Classroom, Teaching Strategies, and our speaker is Sid Dobrin. Sid Dobrin is the Research Foundation Professor and Graduate Coordinator in the Department of English at the University of Florida, where for 10 years he directed the writing program. He's an author and editor of numerous books, including Post-Composition, which was awarded the 2011 W. Ross Winterowd Award for Best Book Published in Composition Theory. He has several other books scheduled to be published soon, and he also has a comprehensive first-year Rhetoric published with Pearson titled Writing Situations. The jumping-off point for his presentation is the observation that the relationships between writing technologies, writing instruction, and student writing have undergone and are undergoing significant changes. These changes are most often identified through the rapid introduction of new tools available to students and teachers. Many of these new technologies and tools appear to function counter to teachers' methodologies and/or philosophies about teaching writing. This presentation offers specific strategies not for using specific tools, but for accounting for the ubiquitous presence of writing technologies in the classroom. Which is to say, in this presentation, Sid Dobrin will offer pragmatic approaches for thinking about and using technology in the classroom. Sid, are you ready to kick off the conference?
I am indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Jean-Pierre for setting all this up on the tech end today. And thanks to everybody who's taking the time out of their day to listen today. As Amy said, and as you can see from the title of my talk today and from the way she described this session, I want to talk pragmatically about some teaching strategies for bringing different kinds of technology to the writing classroom. But in order to do so, I think I first need to talk theoretically about technology, writing, and teaching in order to provide some context as to where I'm coming from and why I'm making the kinds of pragmatic recommendations that I'll make today. So let me begin by saying that there's actually nothing new about talking about technology in writing classrooms. The two have been inseparable since we first conceived of classrooms and even conceived of teaching writing in them. The difficulty we're running into now, however, is that particular kinds of technologies are infiltrating our classrooms at a rate we've not seen before. And in many cases, these new technologies are neither familiar to us nor in line with our teaching practices. Of course, saying that is that these kinds of things are new is also rather evident. But we need to think through why we tend to respond to the rapid mechanization and digitization of writing and writing instruction as we often do. Yes, there are many of us who are eager for the possibilities that different technologies provide us as teachers and as writers, but there are also many of us who are wary of various technological changes, quite uncertain of what to make of new technologies and what possibilities they hold for us and our students. And let's face it, when it comes to teaching in general, the reality is that since the introduction of the chalkboard in 1801, classrooms and teachers have not experienced a technological shift to the degree that we're now witnessing. And let's also remember that there was a tremendous resistance to the use of chalkboards, just as there has been to every other kind of writing technology, the printing press, the pencil, the pen, and even writing itself at the earliest stages of those technologies' introductions to the world. Yet each of those technologies has become ubiquitous, often not even regarded as technology anymore. The best technologies, by the way, are those that become ubiquitous, which become naturalized into the way we do things. Think, for example, about something as commonplace as, say, a spoon. A spoon is a fairly ubiquitous piece of technology. In fact, it's probably one of the most ubiquitous pieces of technology we could identify. Now, early spoons were regional. They were made from whatever local materials were available, shells, bamboo, bone, and so on. But their ubiquity has had a tremendous effect on the world's cultures, contributing to alterations in social dynamics and also in public health, for example. So the spoon, then, are a technology that emerged that can start to give us some idea and some context regarding how we think about emerging technologies we now see and the potential many of these technologies that many of the technologies have for themselves becoming ubiquitous. As we might say, the personal computer, smartphones, GPS, and tablets are rapidly becoming, because let's face it, on our campuses, smartphones are probably as visible as spoons. So why then are so many of us hampered by or resistant to many of the technologies that now emerge in connection with classrooms, writing, and education? I'm going to be reductive for the sake of efficiency here today, and I'm going to say that a lot of what we have such a hard time with integrating new technologies into our classrooms is really tied to a concept of nostalgia. I find myself often attributing resistance to various technologies as a kind of nostalgia for learning the way we once learned. And I think that once we really look at nostalgia, this becomes more evident. To oversimplify here and to identify that there really is a lot of interesting research about nostalgia out there, including work from Plato that attributes nostalgia as being fundamentally unreasonable, I'm going to borrow from a scholar by the name of Brian Turner, who has done a lot of work on nostalgia, and I'm going to identify 4 key aspects of nostalgia that affect my claims about technology in teaching writing. So, first of all, nostalgia suggests a sense of historical decline or loss, often involving some departure from a kind of golden age that once was. Second is a sense of the absence or loss of personal wholeness or moral certainty. In this way, human history is often perceived in terms of a collapse of values which once provided unity among knowledge, personal experience, and humanity. Third is a sense of loss of individual freedom and autonomy, coupled with a loss of, quote, genuine social relationships. And fourth is the idea of a loss of simplicity, personal authenticity, and emotional spontaneity. When it comes to technological resistance in the digital era, I find these facets of nostalgia help explain lots of the resistance we encounter. Tied to this view of nostalgia, I think it's also fair to say that one of the worries that accompanies moves toward mechanization and digital technologies might be described as a fetishization of the university and a fetishization of an intrinsic campus experience. And to be honest about it, in the future, it's likely that this fetishization will serve little purpose, no matter how often we tell ourselves that we believe in the campus experience and the value of the kinds of connections that traditional college life provides. The fact of the matter is that technology shapes culture, and culture shapes technology, but neither drives the other. And so we have to acknowledge the likelihood that in the future, in the machine age, the very understanding of what a campus space is and can be used for will necessarily change. We might even begin to understand that the very idea of classroom stands to become obsolete in these new models. This is not to suggest that the campus spaces will necessarily vanish and will be left only with MOOC-delivering e-universities, but instead that the spatial understandings of a campus will likely change. And what's an interesting point about this regarding technology is that if we look at classrooms and campuses and how they're configured, the reality is they haven't changed much since medieval times. The nostalgia for campuses, of course, is tied directly to that sense of loss of individual freedom and autonomy, coupled with a loss of genuine social relationships. Of course, it's this kind of unpacking that helps us begin to see and think about how technologies in writing classrooms might be thought about more critically. But I promise some practical suggestions, because let's face it, we're writing teachers, and we need practical advice. And it's always great when someone shares ideas that we might use in our own classrooms. And so let me start by saying that the most pragmatic thing that I can offer is to never buy into any of this wholesale. Don't decide to jump into the deep end if you're not ready for the deep end. Your students will be better off if you stick with what you're comfortable with. But that doesn't mean you have to be comfortable all the time. I tell my students that my #1 goal in teaching is to make them uncomfortable. Because when you're uncomfortable, you pay attention to what causes the discomfort. You think about it. You adjust it. You try to find solutions to the discomfort. If you're comfortable with something, you tend to ignore it. Let it be. Let it fade to the background. Sure, that's the idea of ubiquity, but before we get to be ubiquitous about something, some of us are going to have to be a bit uncomfortable. I suppose that's what I mean by this. Don't try to adjust your curricula in a sweeping technologicalization move. Rather, find ways to make small changes. These can come in the form of simply introducing a new technology-based type of assignment. And in a minute, I'll give you a few examples. Or you may even just want to introduce a single reading to get students thinking about technologies they use when they're writing. Some of my favorites to assign, well, they include things like Anwar Akawi's The Telephone, Dana Goodyear's I Heart Novels, Nicholas Carr's Does the Internet Make You Smarter, or Malcolm Gladwell's Is Google Making Us Stupid? There are many others, but the idea is to get students reading, thinking about, talking about, and writing about technology. Akawi's The Telephone, for example, it's a personal narrative about what happened to the small Lebanese village where Akawi grew up when the first telephone was introduced to the village. Of course, telephones have become so ubiquitous that students tend not to think about how the emergence of the telephone affected individual lives and the lives of entire communities. This essay lets me talk about those things without surrendering any of my familiar territory in the writing classroom. Reading an essay, looking at the essay rhetorically, asking students to write their own narratives or to write responses to the essay or to write arguments about telephones and technology. But beyond a reading, you may also want to add a module that focuses not only on writing about and talking about technology, but that employs very particular technologies that you and your students might not consider to be standard ways of writing or of genres to produce. For example, it's probably trite already to suggest students write blogs instead of keeping reading journals. But trite or not, it's also a very effective way to get students writing in an electronic medium. And it's also a great way to get students to think about how their writing circulates in an electronic medium. And for me, this brings up a rather important concept, that of circulation. In a lot of ways, I think rapid circulation has had one of the most profound effects on how we teach writing, or how we should teach writing. What I mean by this is that traditionally, we taught that the writing situation involved a writer, an audience, and a purpose. Oh, got to go back one, sorry. Technology, it's failing me. So traditionally we taught that the writing situation involved the writer, an audience, and a purpose, and a context, the basic idea of the rhetorical triangle. We knew who we were writing for and why. We could tell our students to analyze an audience and write for that audience. We could tell students to understand a context, to develop content and write that content for that audience. But hypercirculation alters this and alters how we have to think about writing. For example, digital circulation disrupts our idea that we ever really know who our audience is. Now, from a pragmatic standpoint, here's how I talk about this with students and how I teach them about circulation and audience. And where I begin, actually, rather than with audience, is with a very basic rhetorical concept of description. That is, I talk with students about how web searches work, about how both humans and non-humans now read our writing and catalog that writing for circulation. If we look at online text, and if we look at print writing, often even now in print magazines and journals, for example, one of the first things we ever see identified are tags, descriptors that help readers of all kinds, human and non-human, figure out where to place the writing, what genre, what content, what context, what objectives, what modes, what aims, and so on. And so I have students look specifically at print magazines they're familiar with to understand how are we now describing these kinds of pieces of writing. And so I focus on description, not in the traditional narration and description and creativity approaches that we've used in the past, but in a new approach that looks at description for circulation. And I have some exercises I'll share with you on how I do this. And some of these are pretty exciting, I think, working with students. So one of the examples that I use in all of my classes right at the beginning of the semester when I have students start to think about description is, and I will admit that I borrowed this and adapted this from a project that Google had produced a couple of years ago, is I start very simply and I ask my students to pair off in class, and I provide them each with a picture, a very simple picture, nothing over the top in terms of detail, and I ask them to each in pairs take 5 minutes, and using a piece of paper and a pencil they each have or a pen, for each of them to write as many words as they can think of to describe that picture. At the end of that 5 minutes, I have them compare their lists, and any word that they both have come up with goes into the left column on a collaborative document, and any word that is individual that the other did not think of goes in the right column. Then I take these groups in pairs and I have them enter into larger groups. They then compare their lists, their collaborative lists, again adding anything to the left-hand column that has been repeated and anything on the right that no one has mentioned yet. All the original words go on the right column. Basically what I'm teaching students to do is the exact same thing that Google does as its approach to expanding its search terms. By the end of the class, I've gotten to where the entire class is looking at creating one list. The list on the left is of all the words that they would use in common, and then the list on the right is all of the words that individuals came up with to describe the picture. Now, part of the reason that I do this is that in addition to teaching students to think about description and how their writing reaches an audience, it's also teaching students to think in terms of research methodologies for learning how to navigate and locate information in a digital environment for later in the semester when I assign research objectives. It helps students start to think about how are other people in the network looking for information that might lead them to their writing, and at the same time, how might they more efficiently locate information in the network to use in their writing. Now, in addition to this, one of the other things that I do while I have students thinking about description is, given that, and I'm going to come back in just a moment to talk about the traditional academic essay, but given that a lot of the digital writing environments in which our students already write provide a different kind of approach to concision than we have traditionally taught, I also early in the semester begin to talk with students about clarity and concision. And so one of the things that I do, and I actually find this a very useful thing in terms of my own time and my own teaching, is that I have eliminated using email as a method for communicating with students. Now, email is an interesting subject for us because it has changed the dynamic in which we interact with our students by providing what is tantamount to 24-hour access of our students to us as teachers. No longer are office hours necessarily what office hours used to be. Students have a question, they can email us, and we respond. The problem with email, though, and I don't have any problem with that dynamic falling apart. Students should be able to ask questions when those questions are paramount in their heads. However, it doesn't give me the opportunity necessarily to teach concision in the way that I'd like to. So I've removed email as a communication tool within the class, insisting only on Twitter. Now, here's my reason for teaching Twitter in terms of this concept of circulation and in terms of this concept of concision. Twitter, for those of you who use Twitter and already realize this, and those who don't, each tweet relies on a limit of 140 characters to convey information. So in my class, when students have a question for me, they may tweet me on our Twitter accounts, but they can only do so once to ask the question. Thus, rather than writing the introductory clause to a sentence, tweeting it, then writing the subject and the verb, and then tweeting it and stretching it out over multiple tweets, I keep them to the 140 character limit. And in order for me to respond, they have to find ways to clearly and concisely convey their question or their comment in those 140 character messages. Now, In some ways, we could leave it at that. But I actually use these tweets as an opportunity to come back into class and say, let's talk about this tweet that student so-and-so sent, and talk about how the concision loses clarity, or talk about why this medium does or does not work for conveying this kind of information. So I very specifically have changed the electronic communication tools I use working with students in order to focus on concision. Because let's face it also, as we're looking at this reconfiguration of genre and of the environments in which students are writing now, that role of concision is very different from the role of concision we taught when we would strictly teach the academic essay. So let's talk for a moment, as I said we would then, about the academic essay. I think one of the discomforts that we as teachers of writing have to now face is the dissolution of the academic essay as the only kind of writing we have students do. I think that one of the things we have to look at now very specifically is that digital documentation, digital documents, digital writing opens the door for expanded kinds of documents, expanded kinds of methodologies, and expanded kinds of approaches to student writing. Now, I am not by any means suggesting that we abandon the traditional academic essay. I find this to be a very useful feature, and a lot of this has a lot to do with how we as individuals see the role of the writing classroom in students' lives. For those of us who see student composition classrooms as serving a purpose for helping students perform in later academic classes, then teaching the academic essay has a very important, very real consequence. For those of us who see the role of the academic classroom as helping to prepare students for the communication that they are going to engage in once they leave the university, once they leave their college classrooms, then the academic essay doesn't necessarily play as important a role as we thought it once would. Because let's face it, it doesn't matter what our students do when they leave the university. Very few of them will ever write academic essays again once they leave. Thus, when I look at all of the electronic media that are in front of us with the possibility of teaching from them, I try to design assignments that allow me to integrate academic essay writing with other forms of digital writing. So, for example, one of the things that I am a big proponent of are radical revision projects. And what I mean by a radical revision project is that I have students move from traditional academic writing into digital documents. So let me give you a couple of examples of assignments that I've used that I find very useful for this. So one of my favorite assignments to give is to ask students to identify a commercial on television. Now, we've all created these kinds of assignments where we rhetorically analyze a commercial, and we've asked students to think about how the media or the advertising agency are making an argument about a particular product. And in a lot of ways, this is a useful rhetorical example because it gives students the opportunity to do the rhetorical analysis of a text and to spend some time really digging at a particular text. But what I like to do is have my students write the traditional rhetorical analysis of the commercial. But then I have them engage in a radical revision. And that radical revision is they then have to redo the commercial based on what their rhetorical analysis reveals. That is, if their rhetorical analysis reveals that there are fallacies in the argument, they have to figure out how to clean that argument up. They then have to, in fact, engage in a lot of research to figure out what's missing, where are the holes, why are we believing the argument of the commercial. And what they find is that there is an emptiness to a lot of the media arguments that are presented before them. And so they then have to take their written analytical, the rhetorical analysis and convert it into a digital video that uses that analysis to convey a more, quote, academic argument that the commercial would then support. I also use a radical revision project. I have a lot of fun with this one. I do this early in the semester when I'm working with narration and still getting students comfortable with the idea of the content that they're working with. I ask students to take, and I've done this with a couple of different texts, to take a very famous text, something like the Romeo and Juliet balcony scene, and for them to take that scene that someone else has written and to revise it into a contemporary setting, and using an online, usually free or whatever the university provides, digital narrative storytelling software or application to animate that scene. What is it that we need to see? What is it we need to hear the characters say? How is it we convey what Shakespeare has conveyed in that scene in a visual media? Now, of course, all of this from the teacher's perspective begs the question, too, about genre and about the real need for focusing or not focusing on essay writing, but integrating and using other forms. One of the things that I have found to this end, rather than necessarily going to the extreme of having students make videos, which in some instances becomes difficult because of access of technology, student ability, but you'll be surprised at how well your students are already making all kinds of videos, is to start to begin image integration into the academic essay, to talk about the relationship between visual description, particularly for me, visual argumentation, and looking at how then students can use digital imagery to in fact support the academic essays that they've been traditionally asked to write. So some of the things that I do with this is I look specifically at visual argumentation. One of the exercises I give students is to provide them with a series of flags, images of flags, various political flags, various national flags, and ask them to begin to analyze those flags, both in terms of how we understand them culturally and then also why we imbue those flags with particular meaning. So, for instance, if we look at the United States flag, there is a history of what the colors are supposed to represent, the stripes, the stars, but yet that meaning is very different from the meaning of the audience interpreting the flag, and depending on where that audience is, who that audience is, and how they read that. I then turn that analysis into the opportunity to ask students to create a visual flag that makes an argument they want to make and see how it plays over with the students in the class as to whether or not their visual representations are conveying that same kind of information. I also, to switch subjects on us for a little bit, I also find that in all of these rhetorical analytical projects that they allow me to move into a different kind of approach to research. And because let's face it, this is one of the places where our frustrations as writing teachers emerge, is that research has changed so drastically. For most of us as students and as researchers and as writers, the idea of research meant getting up, leaving the house or the office and going into a library to a location where information was housed. For our students, research means going online. And so I spend a lot of time talking about the space of research and the value of research. This allows me to talk about collaboration in research. It allows me to look at the value not just of locating information in wikis such as Wikipedia and the positives and minuses of using something like Wikipedia, but then also how they and their collaborators, how other students working on similar projects can use these spaces like wikis to actually create research documents. I also find it very useful to teach students to think about scripting, to think about how they might represent information in visual documentation in ways that we wouldn't necessarily outline in a traditional research form. Now, one of the assignments, and I will admit that this is we might consider this more of an advanced assignment, but I've used it with freshman classes and I've used it with advanced writing classes, and I find it to be just a fascinating example of where we can actually go with digital writing in the classroom, is to use augmented reality technologies and have students actually augment their campus. Now, what I mean by this is there are a lot of free softwares out there that allow using mobile devices to overwrite and layer information onto real locations, either by geolocation codes, GPS, longitude and latitude, or by visual acknowledgement of a particular image. Now, I know that that sounds a little bit confusing, but basically what it is asking students to think about, as they walk through their campus, what information do they wish they had about the buildings, about the places, about the different icons on campus, and then writing those pieces and then putting them into this software so that anyone who opens the particular application on their campus can read this information. Now, we see this being done with a lot of museums of late, where, you know, we traditionally go to a museum and there's a piece of artwork and there's a little cardboard placard that gives us the painter's name or the sculptor's name, the year, the medium, and maybe a little background information. But by using these augmented reality technologies, now the museum has unlimited space because the mobile device becomes the deliverer of the information. I also find this is going to be one of the things we're going to need to be alert to, and how it's going to change collaboration and research as well. Now, earlier I said that I would mention some of the assignments that I've been giving of late as a pragmatic way of thinking about writing in the digital environments. And I've tried to throw a few of those in here. There's some other ones that I use that just sort of help me get students thinking through what it means to write in the digital space. So, for instance, one of the pieces that I have students read is Thomas Friedman's essay, A Kindle in Every Backpack, a proposal for e-textbooks in American schools, in which he proposes putting e-readers in elementary schools and high schools and making that requisite across the board. Now, there are some schools that already have these kinds of programs where all homework is assigned on tablets, reading assignments, contact with teachers is all done through the tablet. And this issue of the e-textbook really of great importance to college students. In fact, the reality is the fact that we're doing this as a webinar right now sort of alludes to the fact of this concept of mobility and the ability to access not just content, but also a community of people talking about the same kinds of things. So I have students then look at this essay and look at this proposal and then create their own proposals about what would it mean to bring an all-electronic environment to your local campus. How would faculty respond? How would students respond? Where would the resistance come from? And have them think about the pluses and minuses of working in an environment like this. Now, I will admit that when I do this, I do not move out of an academic essay form because I want them to make an academic argument about this. I also mentioned the flag assignment that I've been using lately. There's a lot of imaging software out there that works really well with students when they start thinking about how they're visually creating information. And one of the reasons that I teach this way specifically is I really have become of the mind that part of what's happening in the classroom, in how we teach writing and how we think about writing, is that the very notion of what we consider writing is now folding into other concepts like production, circulation, remix, scripting, coding, making. All of these things are tied to the same kinds of productive processes. And so by thinking of writing as more than just the traditional academic essay, but as bringing in visual and requiring the same kinds of processes for producing information and circulating information, I find that I'm able to then really sort of broaden the spectrum of what can I have my students do while teaching the same kinds of curricular goals that I've always had. So one of the things that I have my students also do, given the popularity of online reviews and the popularity of sites like Yelp and Angie's List or ePinions, is to have students start to create and look at how crowdsource information and how the information that they circulate about a product or a service ties into a larger conversation and sort of disrupts our concept of argument, because what it creates then is a concept of a sustainable argument. It creates a concept of a communal argument. And I have students work with online reviews, both video-based and text-based, as a way of thinking about how do we participate culturally in what is written about stuff. And so those are the kinds of assignments that I've really been focusing on of recent. I have found that when we talk about digital writing that we've gotten to a point where it's not just about having students write on screen, because let's face it, the screen is already verging into that realm of the ubiquitous, that very few, if any, of our students are writing in media like pen and paper any longer. And so my assignment design takes into account that I don't have to teach word processing. My curricula is based in the idea that this digital environment is already becoming the ubiquitous environment where our students are probably a little bit more comfortable than many of us are, and that's why we have to take those moments to be uncomfortable. And from a very pragmatic position, one of the things that I really have learned over the last several years is a lot of times we don't want to enter into this discomfort because of the amount of time it takes at the front end, that I have to learn something new. I have to learn a new classroom management software or a new imaging software, and that takes time. And I think in some ways, in addition to nostalgia, that has become sort of our core barrier to overcome, is the idea that we no longer have inherently or through our training everything we need to have to teach the way we want to teach or the way that we should be teaching. That we, in fact, now have to learn as much about these new writing environments as our students, perhaps more if we intend to direct them along the lines of the digital text. And so for me, the front-loaded workload, the learning now, is, I think of this as an investment and how it's going to pay off long-term, because the more comfortable I become with these digital technologies, the easier it becomes down the road, I find. So to sum all of this up, we're going to have to make some changes to how we do things, simply because the technology is changing how we do things. And I hope that in listening to what I've had to say today, that it provides a perspective on why it's going to be important not to wholeheartedly resist the technological shift, but to be critical of the technological shift, while at the same time simply finding our path into this new environment and coming up with exciting, teachable, and useful assignments that are going to help our students in these kinds of writing environments. Thank you all so much for listening for today. I'm going to look over here to the questions and see if we can't answer some questions, so please feel free to chime in. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sid. I wanted to ask a question, kind of going back to your talking about Friedman's Kindle in Every Backpack essay, and I wondered if, in general, what is student response to that essay, and do you see differences, generational differences, or other kind of differences in how students perceive that? And I guess related to that, are you seeing any kind of change semester by semester? Because I know when you look at some things like mashup, like the infographics, you can see this very real acceleration in things like smartphone ownership and usage, and I'm just kind of wondering if that change seems rapid to you, if it seems like there are pronounced differences of opinions on an essay like that and the ideas it's proposing, or what your experience has been with that.
Absolutely, and the changes are quite palpable actually over the last couple of years. I think that the differences aren't only generational. I think the differences are also class-driven and cultural-driven. Mm-hmm. those might seem kind of evident because we're seeing school systems that tend to be a little better off financially already doing a lot of the tablet integration, whereas some of the schools with less resources are not moving in that direction. But this has been part of the digital divide since the outset, so it's nothing new. It's just a different machine to talk about. Now, the attitudes is what makes this much more interesting. So there are certain assumptions that we can make about the growing ubiquity of some of these kinds of devices. Take, for instance, various products that we have generically termed clicker technologies, a lot of which rely on mobile devices. So I use one particular product in one of my classes where students log in on their cell phones, their tablets, their laptops, whatever mobile device they have, simply to acknowledge their presence in the classroom. They take quizzes this way, they can turn in assignments this way, and I don't think 2 years ago I could have relied on the fact that everybody in the classroom will have some form of mobile device that allows them to connect. I notice when I travel around the country talking with faculty, there tends to be a generational faculty resistance to using e-readers or using electronic text. But I'm also seeing a lot of policies change at universities whereby if a book is available digitally, some universities require that faculty acknowledge this to students so that students have the option of using the digital text versus the print text. We have lots of students, and I've talked to lots of students who prefer the digital simply because that's the environment in which they're more comfortable. This ties into that concept of the nostalgia that I was talking about. There are lots of us as faculty. I mean, if I were to turn my webcam on right now in my office, I'm sitting amongst thousands of books. There's something that we value in the material of the book, in the aesthetic of it. And that value is not necessarily culturally inherent, that we're seeing more and more of our students looking toward those e-devices as the comfortable environment in which they're reading and writing. It also changes, I think, how we view the space of where reading and writing occur. With my mobile devices, everywhere is a writing space and a reading space. You know, we grew up with a lot of that myth of, I only write at night, I've got to be at my desk, I've got to have the right cup of tea. Well, mobility is disrupting that notion of where we do these things. And I see more and more students capable, and I want to use that as a positive term, capable of engaging both in reading and writing text wherever they are. And I find that a very useful change. Yeah, there's something wonderful and tactile about the book, but there's also something wonderful about having access to countless books wherever you are.
Thank you. There's another question here, just kind of asking, could you define digital writing? The questioner is Elizabeth Sawyer. She says she may have missed the definition, but you know, toward the end of your presentation, you were kind of talking about what it's not. But what is it?
That's a great question, and normally that kind of question would make me hesitate because the moment you define something, somebody's going to tell you your definition is completely wrong. For me, now, all writing is digital. And what I mean by that is I don't think of writing in that traditional sense of pen to paper, of the writer in the garret with the beret trying to find him or herself in Paris to find the story within. Writing, if I were going to redefine writing, my definition would be making stuff, because the processes by which we're producing an essay versus a label on a candy bar or any other text, a water bottle, a chair, these all now incorporate all of the rhetorical phases we've traditionally assigned to writing, invention, delivery, style. I would throw in design, problem solving. I don't see these things as separable anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I heard somebody give a talk a couple of months ago in which he said that video is the new document. And I thought about that, not necessarily because I agree with it, but because we have to start looking at these blurred definitions, that in fact making a video is making a document, as is making anything else. And these things all get tied together now. Those definitions are not necessarily synonymous, but they're certainly blurred. Production, making, designing, remix, mashable, mashups, all of this tie into digital writing. So my short answer is everything, because everything is making.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like that answer.
It's a tough answer, though, because
it's
idealistic in a lot of ways, because let's face it, our institutions don't want to hear that answer. Because a lot of the things I mentioned are disciplinarily demarcated, that if I'm mm-hmm. teaching video in an English class, I'm not meeting the cultural expectations of an English class, and I'm treading onto territory of mass communication or video production or advertising. And if I'm teaching coding and augmented reality building, then I'm leaked into the computer science department. And so mm-hmm. these are problematic definitions, but I think that it's indicative of this hyper-circulatory, interdisciplinary ecology that we're living in now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's one of those areas where we're kind of reminded that the disciplinary silos do more than just sort of prevent cross-pollination of ideas among, academic colleagues, but in some ways they act to prevent that same process, in terms of how we're teaching and how students are viewing the fluidity between disciplines. And you have to wonder if in some ways that does affect skills transfer, that by keeping those silos in place, we're sort of fractioning off or fragmenting things that, if we could talk about them more holistically or more fluidly, would more naturally lead students to think in terms of transferring knowledge from one discipline or one course to another.
Absolutely. And I think that part of what we have to acknowledge then is, going back to what I said early in the talk about the relationship between technology and culture, how they push at each mm-hmm. other but they don't drive each other, that thrown into that mix then is what the cultural expectations are of particular technologies. That in an English classroom, in a first-year composition classroom, the term technology can only refer to one or two things, using a word processor to write an essay, because you're still in an English classroom and culture dictates what that means. And so that's where a lot of the resistance builds up, both from the outside and the inside, because we do tend to buy into both the disciplinary and the cultural myths of what it is we do.
Yeah. There's time for just one more question. I think it's very interesting. Do you find that students are able to more easily grasp the information by working with technology, or is it just that technology is making information more accessible?
That's a tough question. Wow, I like that. I think there's a couple of things going on that are at play with that. The first is, in terms of access, I think part of what we have to be willing to think about is rethinking the rhetorical concept of memory, and that the memory that we have to somehow have information or knowledge to make it viable, that we've learned something, that we have engaged in a particular way. I happen to think augmented memory is as valuable as wetware memory, that, if my brain can't remember it, that's okay, because I've got it stored somewhere. And this is why we sell our devices with particular quantities of memory. We can determine how much stuff we want to know. Whether students grasp it or not is a different question, because the question then becomes, do they have to grasp it? So let me give a good example of this. For years, when we would teach academic research and teach writing, and in our first year composition courses, we would get to that big assignment of the research assignment at the end of the semester, and we would go over and over and over MLA citation or APA citation or CSE or whatever citation, Kate Turabian, whatever it happens to be, insisting that our students know how to cite things. Well, I don't think we need to teach them that anymore, because every library web page will automatically create a bibliography for them, whereby they're fulfilling the requirement of a citation. And so the question of grasping isn't necessarily that they know how to cite. They do know how to cite. You click the button that says Build Bibliography. The question is, do they understand the context? Do they understand the function of citation in the academic situation? Do they understand why the library even built that button into the web page in the first place? Because of the context. So I think the question of, do they grasp the information, has to become a different kind of question. I think about various sciences that are grounded in taxonomy and the long tradition of having to memorize taxonomical categorizations, and the value that we thought that gave an individual by figuring out where something fits. Well, it's just as easy to go to my mobile phone and figure out what species of bird that is. The question is, what do I do with that? Not just having information, but the function of the information.
Yeah, those are great points. Sid, we're going to have to wrap up, but I have to say there are some really thought-provoking, interesting questions that have come in the last couple of minutes, and I don't know if you can get to those through the question and answer box of the webinar. If not, I'll email them to you, and we'll get a hold of the
well, if you give me 1 second, I'm going to put on screen an email address. I will certainly take the questions that have been posed that you send me, and I will respond to them as best I can. And in the same breath, for anybody who has questions that come up at another time or in thinking through this, there is now on screen a very simple email address, writing_situations@yahoo.com. Please feel free to contact me there if you have questions about anything I've talked about today. If you'd like for me to clarify any of the assignments or any of my objectives, or if you flat out disagree with me, I'd love to hear from you. I find that those are also very valuable conversations to have.
Yeah, and we'll leave this up for the next few minutes. I think one of the questions from Elizabeth Swisher is asking about an example of an essay that you use with augmented reality, and there's some questions in here from Jessica Bannon at the University of Indiana that I think you're really going to enjoy engaging with. So I'll forward those to you, but hopefully anyone else that wants to continue the conversation with Sid can do so via email or via the Twitter hashtag that'll show on the intermission screens. So we're going to let Sid go, and we're going to take about 5 minutes before we come back with our 11 o'clock session on integrating reading and writing within an accelerated course structure. So stay tuned. Thanks, everyone.